Well, most of you have seen him before, but if you haven't, this is Billboard Chris, a child protection activist, and I met up with him right now at the BC United Town Hall after Chris asked the leader of that party, Kevin Falcon, an important question about something many parents are concerned about, and that is the sexual orientation gender identity program that is running rampant in schools.
Both in the school system, parents should be able to opt in to sexual orientation and gender identity lesson plans, and parents should be informed when their child is going by a new gender identity. Would you commit to that? Is my first question. I have a very brief second question.
Because one thing I think everyone always agrees on, no matter where I am, in Fort St. John, in Dawson Creek and Chilliwack, is that we definitely do not want to make sure that young kids, especially vulnerable children, are being bullied in schools, whether it's on their religious beliefs, their ethnicity, maybe they're questioning their sexual orientation, but we don't want them bullied or harassed. Can we all agree that that's probably a good principle, isn't it? Thank you. So, but there's some other principles that are also really important too, isn't there? I think the principles, to me, look like this. Parental involvement in the schools, that's an important principle. Transparency in what goes on in the classroom, that's a very important principle too. Age appropriateness, a really important principle, because some things are age inappropriate, and we got to make sure we get the balance right. And you know how you get that right? You make sure that parents and teachers are part of the discussion to make sure we get them.
All right, we meet again. Last time we met, you gave me a sign. We posed for a picture and it said, Mom, a female who protects her children from gender ideology. And today you asked a question. I was going to ask a very similar one, and you got two out. And let's just show a clip and then we'll get back.
Good evening. So, I should do a quick introduction. My name is Chris Elston. I'm known to many on social media as Billboard Chris because I travel around the world. I'm from Surrey. I live in South Surrey. But I travel around the world and I go out on the street and I go to university campuses. And I'm extremely controversial because I have this idea that our children are beautiful just as they are. And they don't need drugs and scalpels to be their true selves. Yet we have a social contagion primarily sweeping through the female population, where a lot of girls, when they get into middle school and high school, they're naturally having maybe a more difficult time in life. Puberty's not always the easiest time. These girls have been led to believe, often through the school system, but also through online, that they were born wrong, that they're trans, that they should really be a boy, or these boys should really be girls. My wife's a teacher. She did her Master's of Education with your wife at Simon Fraser University. And I also have two girls that are 11 and 14 years old. We have a lot in common. But it is the policy of the BC Teachers Federation right now to hide from parents when their child is going through this identity crisis. Their written policy states, school personnel should not disclose a student's trans status to others, such as students, parents, or other school personnel. So your own daughter's going to school, and now she's got a new name, and she's going by new pronouns, and she's having this affirmation that she was born wrong. And parents aren't being informed. So we saw in Alberta this past week, Danielle Smith presented some beautiful new policies. Yes. One of those policies is that parents must be informed when their child is going by a new gender identity. So my questions are, would you commit to following her lead? Both in the school system, parents should be able to opt in to sexual orientation and gender identity lesson plans. And parents should be informed when their child is going by a new gender identity. Would you commit to that? Is my first question. I have a very brief second question.
Okay, so to your first question. So first of all, what Albertans do for Albertans is probably going to make sense for Albertans. I think in BC, we have to do what's right for BC. And it's founded on the principles that I enunciated earlier. The principles are, and the fundamental one, is parents are the custodians of their children, and parents have a right to decide what is in the best interest of their kids. And I think most people would agree with that. But the principle has to be in the school system. Remember, SOGI was a module, as your wife would know, for teachers. It was never about curriculum in the classroom. But what I hear from people is that some teachers, apparently on their own, are deciding that they're going to make some curriculum out of it. And this is the blowback that you're hearing from some parents that are saying, wait a minute, what's happening in my classroom? Nobody consulted me about this. I think it's very age inappropriate. So we hear these differing stories. Now, and I also must tell you, Chris, sometimes it's, things coming across the border that's actually not happening here, but people, assume must be happening here. And there's some of that confusion going on too. So here's why the principles matter. Because there's 100 different questions that someone can ask me specifically about what about this, what about that situation. So I always say you gotta establish the principles. Principle number 1 is, do parents have a right to be involved in their kids' education? That's an important question. I say yes. The current government would disagree with me. They don't believe so. They think parents should be forced out because the state will know better. I disagree with that. But that's an important principle. Transparency gets to your point. Transparency means just knowing what goes on in the classroom. Parents have a right to know what goes on in their kids' classroom. They do. And if we're trying to hide that from parents, why are we hiding it from parents? That's not right either. And that then goes to the third point, which is age appropriateness. What is age appropriate to be talking about pronouns or to be talking about other subjects that may be controversial?
Okay, so you explained who you were, you asked that question. What did you think about the initial response you received?
So he was trying to be slippery, and he started talking about other issues. I brought up what happened in Alberta, where Danielle Smith brought in these very family-friendly parental rights issues, where parents should be notified when their child is socially transitioning at school. Social transition, of course, being when a child takes on a new name and pronouns. And it's the policy of the BC Teachers Federation to hide from parents that their own child has a new name and pronouns at school. They automatically treat parents by default as though they're abusive to their own children. If they think there's abuse going on at the home, they're mandatory reporters to contact CPS. But this is the one issue in the world where they treat parents by default like they're a threat to their own child. It's outrageous. So I asked if he would commit to requiring BC schools to notify parents when their child has assumed a new gender identity. And he didn't fully commit, but he got about 90% of the way there, I'd say. So that's an improvement. I think with all of these politicians, we need to continually educate them as well, because they're dealing with hundreds of different issues, and they might not be up to speed on all of this. But I'd rather work with them than be a thorn in their side. So hopefully going forward, I can work with these members of the BC United Party to help educate them on these issues, because this is a winning issue. They will pick up voters from the middle and from the left all day long when they advocate for parental rights, and they advocate for my principal message, which is there's no right way to be a boy or girl. Our children are beautiful just as they are. No drugs or scalpels needed. But I think they're afraid to talk about it right now, so we've got some work to do.
Now, you mentioned eventually you did get an answer, but that came after you did a follow-up question of sorts. So let's throw to how you got that answer.
But this is the policy of the BCTF. So will you call for schools to stop keeping these vital secrets from parents?
We're going to do it. Yes, we're going to do a full. We'll make sure that all the parents are involved. We're going to have a discussion around the principles I enunciated. Parents will be part of that discussion. We're not going to push parents out of the system. We'll make sure their voice is heard, and we'll make sure we get it right. And if that's true, that the BCTF is going out and lying to parents, not acceptable. Okay. Not acceptable.
What do you think? You're going around the world, you're talking about this issue, you're going to protest. Sometimes you're getting assaulted for doing it, despite how peaceful your approach is. What do you think is the most common misconception that is sort of fueling this debate that makes it seem so controversial to talk about kids not being mutilated before their frontal cortex is developed, which is responsible for reasoning and thinking for making decisions?
Right. This should be the most common sense thing in the world. We shouldn't be cutting off the body parts of children and sterilizing kids, many of whom are on the autism spectrum, many of whom have suffered abuse or trauma or sexual abuse. But the left has been successful for a long time in painting any opposition as though it's hateful. And they try to conflate LGB with TQ. And we need to stop using these letters together, because the reality of this is a lot of kids who struggle with gender issues growing up grow up to be gay. If you look at all of the academic studies that were done before they gave kids puberty blockers, kids who struggled with gender dysphoria, back when this affected 1 out of tens of thousands, more than 80% of the time they simply outgrew it puberty was the cure for their gender dysphoria. Now we block the cure. And a majority of these kids grew up to be gay. So they've been successful in conflating these issues all together. If you're objecting to sterilizing kids, you must be anti-LGBTQ. Nonsense. Tons of these kids would grow up to be gay adults. And that's why I also have a lot of members of the gay community on my side who are also hammering away at this message that there's nothing wrong with being gender nonconforming. Why are we telling kids that they might have been born in the wrong body? What does that mean? This isn't science. This is a cult. This is ideology.
Yes, and we've covered how there are many gays in the community, Gays Against Groomers, for example, who are speaking out about these issues. But today I also asked South Surrey MLA Eleanor Storko, who is part of the LGBT community, her thoughts on some of this debate. Let's take a look at that now. And I hate throwing around labels, but you are part of the LGBTQ community. And one of the questions that was raised here was about the sexual orientation, gender identity curriculum, SOGI 123. I'm sure you're hearing a lot of parents concerned about that. We've seen marches. 27 cities in British Columbia alone participate in a parental rights march on that. Where do you stand with the parents, or do you not stand with the parents who have concerns about that program and want to be able to opt in or out, but are being told that it is a human right for it to be there?
Okay, so well, first of all, it is true that I'm a lesbian, but I have to say, and I think it's an important distinction that who I identify as in my life has nothing to do with the way that I work on legislation. I work for my constituents, and I put forward the concerns that are brought to my office. And I do hear a lot of concern from parents who are feeling that some of the curriculum that their kids have been exposed to, books in schools, and different teachings, for example, on the number of genders or gender identities, that they're not appropriate. And so, and to be honest, I have kids in the schools as well. My partner and I also have some concerns, we don't know exactly what the curriculum is, and there seems to be not a consistent curriculum being taught about these types of issues even from school to school, which is obviously a concern. So, Kevin and I and the entire caucus, when we talk about SOGI and the concerns of parents, we absolutely are listening to the concerns of parents. We think that we need to do a full review of what's been happening in the classroom. Of course, we want to make sure that we're addressing issues that really exist in British Columbia. But I've had people come to my office to talk about, for example, books. There was a book that actually surprised me very much, had a depiction of a child receiving oral sex. To me, that was surprising. It certainly
Probably gender queer.
Yeah, it wasn't something that was in school when I was there. But right now in BC, parents and students have actually already the ability to identify books like that to the school district to have them removed and to be reviewed. So that's something that does exist. But we want to make sure that parents are well aware of that. And if there are things and materials that parents are uncomfortable with, we need to include the conversation with parents. We need to make sure that things are age appropriate. And we need to make sure that SOGI actually is fulfilling the mandate that it was meant to fulfill. And we do think that if there are things in the classroom that parents are uncomfortable with, well, then they should be able to have that guiding ability for their student. There are parents who opt out of having their kids learn, for example, sex education. They want to teach it in their own way. There are some who prefer their children not to participate in different religious celebrations that are marked in schools. And these types of choices should be honored, and that we need to have the ability to have those open and honest conversations with parents. And we don't ever want to be in a situation where a parent feels that they're being shut out from what's being taught in schools.
I don't think this is going to be the last time you will see Billboard Chris on Rebel News. And if you want to find out some of the past reports from him, you can go to our special website committed to this very discussion. It's called stopclassroomgrooming.com. Share so others are aware. And if you appreciate the work that we do to bring you the other side of the story that the state choice media ignores, you can chip in a few bucks to donate for our efforts while you're there.